We're going to be talking about a very new research finding. Literally, we made this finding last week. It will change every one of your trading strategies, or just you'll actually have a new piece of decisioning logic based on this, and it may introduce fundamental instability in the base fee, so we're a little worried about it. We're not crazy worried about it, but it's like worth paying attention to. So I'll spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about new sources of base fee volatility. I'm Matt, I'm founder and CEO of Block Native. We've been involved in this ecosystem for quite a while, and we love to share what we're working on and finding. We are, as this shirt would suggest, very focused on gas, and if you want one of these shirts, DM me and we'll mail one out to you. But real simple, gas is one of these things that people just don't really spend a lot of brain cycles on, and I would say you're sleeping on it. And the reason is that spot demand for block space sets the spot price for block space. So, hey, we're all on Web3, block space is a commodity, the price of that commodity matters, and you should really think deeply about the quality of the price signal that you get, because the signal today for gas prices across the whole ecosystem is not very good, and it's getting worse. And the reason why it's getting worse is very easy to understand. Spot demand is largely in the public mempool, and we all know the public mempool is shrinking. So as the public mempool becomes a smaller and smaller portion of all demand, we all collectively, every user of every chain, has less visibility into spot price. And that affects pretty much everything. By the way, multidimensional, volatile, emergent. Gas matters to everybody. It doesn't matter who you are, you got to deal with gas up and down the whole stack. And it matters all the time. And it's this highly levered metric. And I like to make the point like, hey, look, arbitrage is determined in part by the gas spread. And so if you have additional scatter in your gas price, you will have additional scatter in your arb break even, and that will affect every price on your venue. So like gas is one of those things that kind of cranks through everything else, and we all kind of assume it's right, and it turns out it's not, okay? And we're gonna talk about how it's not right, because basically all of Web3 is staying on top of these gas markets that aren't really well researched and aren't really well understood, and this is what we at Block Native are increasingly focused on. So just by way of analogy, you build new instruments, you can make new observations. This is the moons of Jupiter. This is a whole galaxy cluster, obviously. And then what happened here, what we'll be sharing with you is we made an upgrade to our own platform. So we have this thing called Ether now. It provides a transaction explorer that's like Etherscan for mempool data. It used to look like this. Now it looks like this. It's publicly available, by the way, made possible for a generous grant from the Ethereum Foundation. Your Ethereum Foundation grant dollars at work is right here. And we basically put gas at the center of all of this. And in doing so, we saw something we didn't really expect to see, and we started to scratch at it. And that's what I'm going to share with you now. So, okay, first off, growth in private transactions. So private transactions, these are privately transmitted transactions. By the way, I tweeted on this, and a whole bunch of people got all wrapped up that there's no such thing as private transactions on Ethereum. Like, I want to be really clear. These are privately transmitted transactions, i.e. those transactions that don't appear in the public mempool until they show up on chain. Okay? This should be familiar to everybody in the room. And they've been percolating along at about 10% of the network, but pretty recently they started to accelerate, and now they're fully 30% of the network. Okay? There's this very important phenomena called mempool pressure. So the mempool is a continuous flow environment. Anyone can submit a transaction at any time, and blocks are a discrete environment. It's like the difference between an elevator and an escalator, right? And so, you don't really think so much about it. Pressure builds up on the mempool, and a new block comes in, and the pressure dips down, and then more mempool transactions come in, and a new block comes in, the pressure goes down, and every now and again we have a missed slot. What happens in a missed slot? A block doesn't get created, and that pressure on the mempool builds up. So in the slot that immediately follows a missed slot, you have double the number of transactions, and that block is going to be twice as full, right? Makes sense, not hard. Except now with this, there's two forms of mempool pressure that matter. There's public mempool pressure, which is observable, and there's private mempool pressure, which is not observable. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but by itself, probably not that concerning. But then it crosses with something completely unrelated, and it starts to create base fee instability. And this is this new thing. So with this tool that we have, you can look at blocks, and you can see the percent public versus private in the block and their distribution. So in this case, the light blue are public transactions, and the dark blue are private transactions. It's actually really cool. You can look at the ordering, and you can see sandwiches occur, and all this sort of jazz is all available. But as we literally built this, we're testing it on staging internally, we start to notice blocks that look like this. And you'll notice it's all one color. These are 0% private transactions. That's sort of strange. And we realize, like, oh, these are vanilla blocks, or altruistic blocks, or self-built blocks, right? We talk about this. And in fact, you use rated network, anything else, and you'll know 90% of all blocks on Ethereum are run through MEV-Boost. But what about that other 10%? Turns out that other 10% doesn't have access to the private transaction flow, which historically wasn't that big of a deal because there wasn't very much pressure on the private mempool side of things, and now there is. So these two weird things, 30% private mempool pressure and 10% of all blocks are produced in an altruistic, self-built way. And so if you really start to think about this, you go, wait a sec, this should cause some volatility in the base fee, because you're going to have blocks that are artificially small, followed by blocks that are artificially not small. And that's going to affect us all, and it turns out that's exactly what happens. So I'm going to show two examples here. This is a real, like, simple breakdown. This is 6 consecutive slots along the bottom. This is all real data, by the way. And the blue in this chart is percent private. And the one that we're really paying attention to is this blank one. This is an altruistic self-built block. Contains no private transactions. And you'll notice that the slot immediately after the altruistic slot spikes high. So you can't quite read it, it's a little bit hard, but basically baseline is 30% private. This particular block is about 60% private, doubles up like you'd expect. And so what happens here is the gas used also follows this characteristic spike. So this altruistic public block is only about 15 to 20% full, and the block immediately thereafter is literally 99.7% full or something like that. So you get this artificial dip in gas utilization due to altruistic self-built blocks not having access to private mempool flow. And so now you have inefficient utilization of network resources here and overutilization of network resources here. And for those of you who are familiar with how 1515 mine mechanic works, is this, of course, alters the base fee. So, by the way, just by way of terminology here, we have this idea of a self-built block, and we'll be talking about that. But then there's a special thing called the recovery block. I don't know, we might change the name of it, but the recovery block is the block immediately after a self-built block. And they're bigger than normal blocks. This is highly repeatable. I'll show more expanded data. And what happens here is basically you have this swing in gas used. So the publicly built altruistic block has a dip in gas, and then there's this big spike in gas. Literally, it's like a 400% swing. And this is the smoking gun. This is what the base fee does. The base fee is sort of percolating along. Immediately after the altruistic self-built block, the next block, the base fee dips because this is an underutilized block, and then the recovery block spikes it back up, okay? Now, another interesting factor, and this has been mentioned a couple of times, there's strong evidence of timing games here. This is a little bit hard to interpret. These are 3 different blocks. The yellow is an altruistic block, and the blue and the green are the block before and the block after, both MEV-Boost blocks. And it turns out that what happens is, due to timing games, that the builders are building for the full 12 seconds, and the altruistic self-built blocks generally only build for anywhere from 8 to 10 seconds. So not only do they not have access to 30% private mempool pressure, but they also don't have access to the full time for mempool pressure to build up. And so literally, they get double squeezed, which explains why these altruistic self-built blocks are significantly smaller than the MEV-Boost blocks. Okay, so now let's zoom out a little bit. The first question you should ask yourself is, so how common are altruistic self-built blocks? And it turns out way more common than I expected. It's basically like just under 10% of the network. So this is daily data. The orange at the top are the altruistic self-built, and the blue is everything else. And so literally about 1 in every 11 blocks has this characterization. And do they really consume less gas? Yes, it's like pretty black and white. MEV boost blocks, altruistic self-built blocks. This is gas use, okay? Now, this one's a little bit harder to interpret. The colors change around. These are those recovery blocks that I mentioned, the special ones. And these are MEV boost non-recovery blocks. So literally, you split apart. And so the blocks that immediately follow a altruistic self-built block do have measurably more gas consumption than average. And this creates this effect, which is how much does it move the base fee on average? And the key here is the little one. The green is the average MEV boost block that is not a recovery block, barely budges the base fee, because they're generally pretty close to 50% full. They're pretty efficient. But you know what? Those altruistic self-built blocks drive the base fee down, and then the recovery block drives the base fee up. And this is this new form of volatility in the base fee that does not accurately reflect spot demand, okay? Now, two really important things to know about this. The nature of 1559 fee escalation means that the way that it works is it's much easier for the price to rise than it is to fall. So 1559, maximum interblock change is 12.5%. And the block-to-block change is 12.5% at 100% full block, and the negative 12.5%, the minimum, sort of the maximum reduction, is that is 0% full block. So ask yourself, how likely are we to get 100% full blocks? Pretty accurate, pretty common. How likely are we to get a 0% full block? Not very common. So what winds up happening here is the base fee dips and the base fee rises, and then the base fee decays back to a baseline before it does it again. And that's at 30% public mempool or private mempool pressure, 30% private. So what will happen will be as the private mempool grows, 30%, 40%, 50%. At about 50%, my guess is this gets a lot worse if current trends hold. And the reason why is you'll have 100% of a block on the private side and the recovery block plus all the public. So it will take 2 blocks for the backlog to clear. The base fee will rise across 2 blocks, and then we'll have less time to decay. Now, there's some pressure relief in here. We've been working with the EF on this stuff a little bit, going back and forth with some researchers. There's, I think, some mechanisms that we need some more research on, but that ultimately the base fee is getting less and less reflective of demand, and it affects us all. Hey, by the way, if you transact regularly, do you check if the last block was self-built? Because you should. Because if the last block was self-built, you know the next block is going to have an artificially low base fee, and the next block after that's going to have an artificially high base fee, and it swings about 20%. So that's a good source of alpha for all y'all here. So by the way, if you listen to the common narrative, is if you're a proposer, oh, build altruistic blocks, do the right thing by the network, watch out for MEV, and oh, don't be a bad MEV boost user. But it turns out that this data would suggest the opposite, that you actually, the happy path may be the opposite. And I'll close on this. This is Rated Network. And Justin Drake actually helped me sort of get into this. Some of the data we see, we sort of scratch our head over. Like, we see a lot of Lido vanilla blocks, self-built blocks. Like, you'd think Lido, like they're the big guys. But if you dive into this, you will see that Lido on average is 7.2% vanilla. There's a shocking percentage of all Lido blocks exhibit this capability. And you can actually click into it further, and there's specific providers inside Lido, like Attestant and ChainSafe, that are like 76% vanilla. So there is probably some stuff we're going to need to do about this. The good news is I think that there's some folks we could talk to probably make things okay. So one, we just want to let everybody know I'm here to sort of disclose this to a room full of people who can do stuff about it, and we think there's sort of more research required. We're going to be documenting all these results and publishing next week. We were here, so we couldn't do it, but we're going to get this out so everybody's aware. I think we all need to start thinking about what happens when we hit 50% private transactions, and you'll notice I didn't say if, it's when. Because we really don't want the base fee to get non-deterministic. We think that'd be bad for network health. And that ultimately, we're probably going to need to drive down altruistic blocks. By the way, there is this whole other factor on min-bid. And so as this grows, min-bid may come in, and so we may naturally get fewer altruistic blocks. We're not entirely sure about that. Or we could have less private flow. You tell me, was less private flow something you're interested in? If you're a searcher, that's a good thing. If you're on the other side, it's not. And there's all sorts of interesting dynamics. And maybe we need to start thinking about adjusting the 1559 fee asymmetry that exists today. And that was Gas Matters, new sources of base fee volatility with 10 seconds left. There you go. Thanks so much for listening. Appreciate it, everybody. Cheers.